Well, hey, good morning. And why don't you just say hello to John here? All right. Good morning. Hi. It's my honor to reintroduce John Dickson to you. For those of you that have been around for a while, by my count, John has been, I think it's like your fifth time to open the scriptures for us in a weekend service. And so, I don't know, there's a point where someone is a guest, and then there's a point where you just designate them your resident Australian. So every church needs one.
I'm happy to play that part.
All right. John is a senior pastor of a church outside of Sydney, Australia, where he was raised, St. Andrew's Church, Roseville, outside of Sydney. John has done a couple powerful documentaries. In addition to that, wrote a bunch of books. One of them, most recently, a book called Doubter's Guide to Jesus. And what I love about John's books is that many of them, while they're picked up by a Christian audience to grow in their faith, many of the books are written particularly with a person that's just kind of on the fence or exploring in mind. So the Doubter's Guide to the Bible and Doubter's Guide
to the Ten Commandments.
To the Ten Commandments. Yeah, and Doubter's Guide to Jesus. So we have these available in each of our atriums at each campus. And so if you're interested in picking one up, however, word of warning, if you take it home and devour it, you need to know something. I'm going to be asking you to read it again, because this coming fall, we are going to be using this book as the companion volume for our fall series. Often in the fall, we prepare a booklet that we hand out to everybody. This year, we're going to be asking people to read sections of Doubter's Guide to Jesus. And so take it home, devour it, mark it up, but know that it'll probably be the first pass of two that you will be taking with this material. And John has just been so gracious with his time. In addition to doing weekend services, we get to do an event tonight, Conversations for the Curious. I know this event tonight, if I can just get pitchy for a second, it works on two different levels. One is we always have people who are exploring the Christian faith and just wondering, this idea of God, I mean, can you give me some evidence that like God is out there, specifically that faith in Jesus is reasonable? But in addition to that, we have people raised in the church who get to a point where they just go, man, I just don't know anymore. I mean, and so it's a faith confirming event as well. So we invite you to hang out with us 6 o'clock tonight for that. John, we love you, and we are so grateful for your generosity of time and being with us. So can you join with me in welcoming John again to our platform?
Brother. Thanks. Man, I didn't know I had to do all that tonight. Yeah, I did. It's fantastic to be back here, and a special welcome to my friends over at the Kentwood, East Paris, and Knapp Street campuses. In fact, I've been bumping into people around Grand Rapids from the various campuses, and they've been saying g'day. Actually, they haven't said g'day, they've said, howdy and stuff like that. But in fact, when I checked into my hotel in downtown 2 nights ago, I actually got in a lift with someone whose key card wasn't working. Ours was working just fine, and they couldn't work it, and I made some wisecrack, and they said, you're that Australian pastor. You're John Dickson. We're from Knapp Street. So special shout out to my friends at Knapp Street. I can't remember your names. I trust you're not still in the lift trying to find your floor. Hey, some of you may know the completely untrue story, the only untrue story I'll tell you today, that illustrates perfectly what I want to try and do with you. 4 people in an aircraft that lost power to its engines started careering toward the ground. The pilot came out and explained the problem to the 3 passengers and said, look, it's worse than you might think because there are 4 of us and only 3 parachutes. My plane, my parachutes. I've got to take one. And he straps it on, he jumps out to safety. Left on the plane were a brilliant professor, a pastor, and a backpacker just making her way around the world. And the professor jumped up and said, look, I am one of the greatest minds on the planet. I surely must survive. I must take one of the final parachutes. The others thought that was reasonable enough, so he strapped it on, he jumped out. The pastor started to explain to the backpacker, I've lived a long life. I know where I'm going when I die. You take the last parachute. She said, no, it's okay. That brilliant professor, he just jumped out with my backpack strapped on. Okay, it's a bit of a dad joke, I acknowledge, and it's completely untrue, but it illustrates something that is profoundly real. It's possible to assume you have the real thing when in fact you have a poor substitute. Now that's a real problem, jumping out of an aircraft at 30,000 feet with nothing but a PhD and a backpack instead of a parachute. But it's also true down here on the ground, especially as we talk about Christianity. It's possible to assume you've embraced real Christianity. But on closer inspection, you realize actually it's a poor substitute. Or maybe a plastic Jesus, as Jeff has been saying throughout this series. Equally, it's possible to have rejected what you assumed was real Christianity. But actually, it wasn't real Christianity you rejected. It's a plastic version. I find this all the time in Australia. And I find this particularly with the kind of skeptics like Richard Dawkins, most famous atheist in the world, whose book, The God Delusion, has sold multiple millions. And he is a smart guy. But all the way through his demolition of Christianity, I found myself not really recognizing the Christianity he critiques. It's like some other shallow version he demolishes, not the Christianity that I've come to understand. And he makes the surprising admission partway through the book. He says that he looked into Christianity and saw through Christianity as a 12-year-old. Now, of course, he was probably a very bright, precocious 12-year-old. But as soon as he said that, it explained why I didn't really recognize the Christianity in his book, because it does seem like the Christianity that he demolishes in The God Delusion is the Christianity frozen in the mind of a 12-year-old and never seriously explored since. And I wonder whether that's possible for anyone watching today. That you've rejected what you assumed was real Christianity, but actually it isn't real Christianity. Or maybe you've assumed you've embraced real Christianity, but it's not the real thing. So what I want to do with you today is a kind of safety check. Sort of checking that what we've got strapped on is a parachute, not a backpack. That we're safe in God's mercy. Not just assuming God's mercy or assuming God's non-reality. And we have a beautiful scene, awful but beautiful scene. Over these weeks, you've tracked Jesus from his Last Supper, where he surprised his disciples with words that are familiar to us in the modern world, but which really would have puzzled them at the moment, where he said, "This bread is my body broken for you." And then he poured the glass of wine and said, "This wine is my blood shed for you." And from there, they sung a hymn and they went to a garden, the Garden of Gethsemane, which you explored last week, where Jesus pours his heart out. His disciples fall asleep in this darkest hour. And Jesus says to his Father, "If there's any other way, please take this cup away. But not my will, your will, your will." He is then arrested because he's betrayed by one of his closest colleagues. From there, he is beaten, he is tried, he is beaten, he is tried, and then he is led out to be executed with two other criminals. Picture the scene. A criminal over there, naked, bleeding, dying. A criminal over there, naked, bleeding, dying. And Jesus in the middle, naked, bleeding, dying. A crowd has gathered to watch because crucifixion in the Roman world was shock and awe just as much as it was capital punishment. And an amazing conversation breaks out. In these brutalities emerge the three realities of the Christian faith, the three parts of the safety check I want to explore with you today. And the first part of the safety check has to do with Jesus' greatness, because you'll notice in the passage, everything focuses on Jesus' identity. Who is he? And we're told there in verse 35 that the people stood watching and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, he saved others, let him save himself if he is the Christ of God, the chosen one, if he is the Christ. We're told the soldiers also came up and they mocked him. These are the Roman soldiers with hammers and nails. They offered him wine vinegar and said, if you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. One of the criminals who hung there, let's picture it as the criminal over there, seized Jesus and hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us. Everything focuses on Jesus' identity as the Christ. That's where our earliest sources push us. But people are rejecting this and perhaps projecting onto Jesus their own version of who they think he is. And actually, it's the same today in the contemporary world. People are projecting onto Jesus their own preferred image. I think of the famous film by Martin Scorsese. I'm not sure how many of you have seen The Last Temptation of Christ. It's not a film I would at all recommend. Jesus is this kind of sexually repressed, misunderstood half-prophet who doesn't really get God, doesn't really get his own mission. I wonder if we're seeing a projection onto Jesus. Contrast it with Mel Gibson's very famous The Passion of the Christ, where Jesus is pretty much beaten up for 90 minutes. He's the sacrificial lamb. That's all Jesus is. If you like your Jesus beaten to a pulp, that's the film to watch. But again, are we perhaps seeing a projection? And then, of course, not to be too naughty, there is the left-wing Jesus who holds little lammies and wouldn't hurt a fly. And then there's the right-wing Jesus who probably would hurt a fly. And then there's the guru Jesus of Deepak Chopra, guru to the stars. Oprah Winfrey loves him. And he wrote a book called The Third Jesus. Forget the historical Jesus, we know nothing about him. Forget the church Jesus, they're just making him up. I have come to reveal the real Jesus, the third Jesus. And you know what? When you read that book, it turns out Jesus is really just an enlarged Deepak Chopra. Very similar to an Indian guru who said very Indian guru things. But again, it's a classic example of how people, they're fond of Jesus, so they project their preferences onto him. But all of our earliest sources say that he is the Christ. Not just a good teacher, not a guru figure, not a misunderstood prophet, not simply a sacrificial lamb, the Lord, the King, the Christ. In fact, non-Christian sources from the ancient world refer to Jesus as the Christ. So here's Tacitus. If you know anything about the ancient emperors, Tiberius, Caligula, Nero, and so on, you probably got it from Tacitus via your history teacher. He said Christians derive their name from a man called Christ, who during the reign of Emperor Tiberius had been executed by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, the Christ. Same with the first century Jewish writer, again, not a Christian. Josephus writes, about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, a doer of baffling deeds, a reference almost certainly to Jesus' healings, who was called Christ. Pilate condemned him to be crucified. Christ, which I used to think was a surname. Because, Australia is really pagan, so you got to forgive us. We all descend from convicts, right? Unlike you guys, searching for a brave new world, pilgrims looking for a promised land, we were just basically an awesome prison. The British sent us out there, they thought they were punishing us. We arrived and we went, thanks. But basically, we don't know our religion. And so I grew up without any religion in my home. I'd never been inside a church. And one of the things I assumed wrongly was that Christ was his surname. Because people said Jesus Christ like they said John Dickson, Jeff Mannion. So obviously his mum and dad were Mary and Joseph Christ, Grandpa Christ, Grandma Christ, Auntie Christ, Uncle Christ, just the Christ family, right? You laugh, but okay, you laugh. But of course it was a title. And someone pointed out to me that it was a title, and it changed lots of what I began to think about Christianity. But let the younger John Dickson explain the title Christ.
Each day, Orthodox Jews recite prayers for their long-awaited king. Have mercy, our God, on Jerusalem, your city, on the monarchy of the house of David, your Christ. Or in Hebrew, Mashiach, Messiah.
The word Messiah means anointed one. It's a reference to the coronation ceremony of ancient Israelite kings. The new monarch was anointed with olive oil as a symbol of God's power being poured out on the individual. The model here was the shepherd turned warrior king named David. 1,000 or so years before Jesus, David was selected, anointed, and ruled Israel for a generation.
The Jewish scriptures, or what Christians call the Old Testament, promised that a descendant of David would one day rule all the nations. He'd be anointed not just with oil, but with the Spirit of God. He would speak and act for the Almighty. This deep Jewish longing for a Messiah descended from David helps us to appreciate the scandal at the heart of the Gospels. They claim Jesus was that anointed one, the Christ. He is the one to speak and act for God. The problem was, he didn't quite fit the job description.
The job description many in his day wanted for the Christ, the coming one who was anointed to speak and act for God, was to come and kill the Romans. They wanted a political savior. Jesus didn't come like that. And so that probably explains why many people in his day said, you can't be the Christ. Especially look at you on a cross. You're being killed by the Romans, but the purpose of the Christ was to kill Romans. But what everyone else rejected that day, one man accepted. And our passage is very clear about it. The other criminal, this is the criminal on the other side of Jesus, who has heard the crowd, the leaders, and the first criminal all criticize Jesus and reject his status as Christ, gets it. But the other criminal rebuked him. That is, he rebuked the first criminal. He said, don't you fear God, since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. I have no idea how he worked it out that Jesus was the Christ, the Lord of God's kingdom. Because Jesus, I mean no offense in saying this, Jesus didn't look very kingly. He didn't really look like he had a kingdom coming any moment now. But somehow this criminal worked it out. I wonder, had he heard the rumors that had spread all throughout Galilee and Judea that Jesus could give sight to the blind, could heal the sick, could even raise the dead, could calm a storm. Maybe this criminal had even half witnessed something like that. However, he realizes that he works out this is the one with all authority to let me into the kingdom or not. He realizes Jesus' greatness. And this is the first part of the safety check of Christianity. Have you realized Jesus' greatness? Not as a teacher, not as a life coach, not as a guru, but as the one who speaks God's words, who acted God's deeds. Many of us, well, where I come from, I don't know the US enough to know whether it's really true here, but many of us flatter Jesus with complimentary images that actually miss the point. Jesus is quite famous in Australia. People aren't so sure about Christianity, but Jesus they like. I think they quite like the way he was a rebel against religious authority, and Australians love rebelling against all kinds of authority. But it's possible to have flattering misconceptions of Jesus. Friends of mine have good mates with a high-end jewelry shop in Sydney. And some years ago, an American gentleman walked into this shop in the center of Sydney and asked to buy a pink Argyle diamond. If you know your diamonds, this is very expensive, about $20,000. And during the transaction, the computer froze. And the woman behind the counter was all embarrassed, but this American guy just leant over, offered a shortcut key. The computer came back to life. She said, "Oh, you know a little about computers, do you?" He just nodded, finished the transaction, took his diamond and left. Only later in the day, when they were searching through the credit card receipts, did they come across one, I kid you not, that said Mr. Bill Gates, who, yes, was in town for the big Microsoft conference in Sydney. And suddenly this woman felt really silly for having asked him, "You know a little about computers, do you?" When this is the guy, that kind of ruled the computer industry worldwide, unless you use Mac. And so I wonder how many of us do that with Jesus. You know a little about life, do you? You said some beautiful things, Jesus. I like how you lived, Jesus. You can be my life coach, Jesus. A flattering misconception when he is the Lord, King of God's kingdom. Have you realized Jesus' greatness on his own terms? That's the first part of the safety check. And the second arises almost naturally from the first, because when you realize someone's greatness, surely you can't help but acknowledge your unworthiness in their presence. And I think that's what happens to this criminal who spots that Jesus is the Lord of God's kingdom. He is the Christ. But look at his willingness to express unworthiness in public. The other criminal rebuked him. That is, he's yelling across Jesus to the first criminal. "Don't you fear God? You are under the same sentence. We are punished justly. We are getting what our deeds deserve. This man, he's done nothing wrong." I find it extraordinary that this man would freely acknowledge his wrongdoing in front of a fellow criminal, in front of the crowd, in front of those who crucified him, and in front of Jesus. He knows this is not a time for running away from reality. This is a time for acknowledging wrongdoing. In the presence of Christ's greatness, he feels his smallness. In the presence of Christ's purity, his impurity. In the presence of Christ's love, he knows his own self-absorption. Now, I know that the church generally has made a lot of mistakes in this area. I fear that when I talk like this, some of you have been damaged by preachers, certainly not your regular preacher, who have so slammed the pulpit and preached judgment, guilt, and shame as a means of control. I've met people for whom this is real, and it's damaged their ability to connect with God. In my very first week as an assistant pastor in Sydney, I was asked to visit a woman named Judy. She was dying of cancer. She lived in our local area, but she was not a churchy at all. But she lived next door to a churchy, pretty serious Christian, who contacted me and wanted to set up a kind of spiritual blind date with Judy and me. So I went over, she was nervous, I was nervous. We talked about serious things because she knew she had weeks left. But it turns out Judy used to go to church 40 years earlier, but gave up on it one day after one sermon. She said she heard a preacher preach about judgment, hell, sin, guilt, shame, the whole package, with a smile on his face, as if he was above everyone. And she said, I walked out of that church and I've never been back since. It was a very difficult path for Judy to see any sense in the biblical idea of sin, guilt, shame, judgment. She had to do what is very difficult to do. See past the cliche to the truth. Because some of the best things in the world, including in Christianity, have been so repeated and turned into caricatures that they become cliches so that there's a truth in the center of the cliche you can't see anymore. And it's partly the church's fault for the way it's delivered this stuff. But at the same time, there's another side of the coin. Because frankly, we live in a culture that just doesn't like being made to feel bad. We think if something makes us feel bad, it is bad. We're such a therapeutic culture in the West that any message that makes us feel, slightly on the wrong side of justice or goodness, we reject. I read a really interesting article last year called The Strange Persistence of Guilt by Professor McClay at the University of Oklahoma. Not a Christian article, but a 10,000-word history of guilt. I know that doesn't sound like fun, but it really was an awesome article on the history of the West and how the West, unlike any other culture that has existed, has tried to sidestep the notions of guilt and shame. Every other culture has tried to work out a way of managing it. We've tried to sort of bury our head in the sand or dodge it completely. And McClay points out that there were two very significant moments in Western history that have influenced all of us, even if we don't really even know these names. Friedrich Nietzsche, the great German atheist philosopher, argued powerfully against there being any objective right and wrong. He said objective right and wrong is a myth. There's no right, there's no wrong. It's all completely arbitrary. It's all completely subjective. And so he did away with objective guilt because there's no objective right and wrong. But that left the lingering psychological sense of shame, and it fell to Sigmund Freud in the early 20th century to deal with shame. And he, also as an atheist, criticized all notions of shame as psychological maladies that you need to heal yourself from. So Nietzsche does away with objective guilt, Freud does away with subjective shame, and our culture has been trying to hold on to those ideas ever since. But as this article points out, there is a strange persistence of guilt. He doesn't quite say it in the article, but I think it's because objective right and wrong is real. And so subjective shame is actually a good emotional reaction to real objective wrongdoing. Now, please don't mishear me. I know that there are some people with such tender consciences who, because of upbringing or maybe just psychology, have actually felt too much shame. I get that that is a reality, but what I'm talking about is the way our culture has tried to get rid of guilt and shame. It's a little bit like a narcissistic sociopath. In life, if you meet someone who treads on everyone to get where they're going and feels no appropriate ache of soul, we call that a narcissist or a sociopath, right? But when it's a whole culture trying to avoid any sense of guilt and shame, we call it enlightened. It's not enlightened. It's an unreality. Christianity does teach we have all fallen short. So may I ask you, have you acknowledged your unworthiness? Not compared to me, not compared to Jeff, compared to Christ's standard. A standard he made perfectly clear the week before he died. He was asked, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" A favorite question of the time. Summarize the whole will of God to one thing, will you, Jesus? But look what he says. Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment." And he's not playing the game of just one command. There are two. And second is like it. love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. I find this such an amazing insight into what God's standard is. Love God with all your heart. Love your neighbor as yourself. What could be more logical than giving reverence to the source of all life, to the being that produced our being? And what could be more logical than looking at other creatures and feeling a certain compassion toward their plight? And the interesting thing about this twofold expectation that Christ laid down is that it leaves no room either for the religious hypocrite who loves God but doesn't love people. Ever met any of those? It's disgusting, isn't it? But it doesn't leave any room for the moral agnostic who says, oh, I love my neighbor, but I don't think about God. We rightly see the religious hypocrite who loves God but not people as disgusting. I just want to put this seed of thought into your head. If Jesus' standard is the real standard, surely the moral agnostic who loves people but not God is in the same position as the religious hypocrite who loves God but not people. To Jesus, they both fall short. And so the appropriate question is, have we acknowledged this, admitted this, been upfront like this criminal next to Jesus, who acknowledged Jesus' greatness, admitted his unworthiness as the doorway to the third part of the beautiful safety check? He asks for forgiveness. Look at verse 42. Then he said, this criminal over here, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus answered him, I tell you the truth, today you'll be with me in paradise. I often wonder what inspired him, what gave him the confidence to ask Jesus to accept him. It's not very flowery religious language, is it? O Lord, thou art worthy, I art a worm, forgivest thou mine iniquities. Sounds good in an English accent, doesn't it? But there's none of that. He just says, Jesus, will you remember me? Look at my face, please. Will you remember me? Wow. It's so humble, it's simple. Maybe he'd heard the rumors that this Jesus wined and dined with the worst sinners he could find. He would wander around Galilee and Judea, find out who the sinner of the town is and say, I'm coming to your house. The religious folk were all scandalized. How could he do that? But he did, because he was trying to convey the friendship that God has on offer. I wonder if this criminal heard those rumors that Jesus was something like a friend to the sinner. And he thought, well, maybe I've got a shot. Remember me. Remember me. And Jesus' reply is so beautiful, simple, and overwhelming. I tell you the truth, today you will be with me in paradise. He didn't ask to be with Jesus, just to be remembered. He didn't ask to be in paradise. He just wanted like a little corner of the kingdom. But such is God's mercy in Jesus Christ that the forgiveness that is on offer from Jesus is total and free. God's forgiveness eclipses the greatest guilt and shame. There is nothing you could have done or could possibly do that can't be forgiven by God with this overwhelming, simple, free forgiveness. And I hope, even if you've heard this 1,000 times, as I know you have if you're a regular at this church, this is unique in the traditions of the world. This idea that forgiveness is free is unique. I used to teach a course on the history of the world religions for a state university in Australia. And we would walk our way through Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam, and also Christianity. And all my students noticed this radical difference because they had to read the Upanishads and the Tripitaka and the Quran. And they noticed that whereas Christianity says forgiveness is free, no other tradition does. This is no criticism of Hinduism, but Hinduism teaches there are 3 paths to salvation and only 3. And you've got to choose one of them and devote yourself to one of them. The first is the path of knowledge. It is the path of ascetic alignment with your mind to the mind of Brahman. You've got to spend enough time in transcendental meditation, enough philosophy, so that you will eventually merge with Brahman. It is considered the most difficult of the paths. The second path is the path of deeds, the karma path. That is, you've got to do enough deeds that are appropriate to your life and situation to counterbalance the bad deeds that you've done or the lack of good deeds that you've done. And if you've done enough deeds, you may eventually, after many lives, many reincarnations, eventually achieve liberation, what the Hindu calls moksha. The third path is the most popular path. In the Bhagavad Gita, one of the central Hindu texts, this is said to be the preferred path. It's called bhakti or devotion, where you find one God, your favorite God, and you devote yourself utterly to that God. You say the God's name on your lips constantly. You devote your life each day to that God. You offer offerings in your home and to the temple. You think of that God constantly, and if you've done enough devotion, that God may take pity on you and save you. This is not to criticize our Hindu friends. This is what they would teach you if you sat down and said, tell me about the paths of salvation. And it's the same with Buddhism. The Buddha didn't quite believe in the Hindu salvation. He broke away from Hinduism, but he taught about nirvana. That is the escaping of all mental and bodily corruption and agony. But he said there is an 8-fold path. You have to do all 8 things to reach nirvana: right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right understanding, and so on. And only if you do these things will you eventually be unbound from this world, which is what nirvana means. And finally, our Muslim friends. If they were here, they'd say, the path to salvation is clearly explained in the 5 pillars. You do these 5 things, and there's every chance you'll be forgiven by Allah. You make your proper confession. That's how you begin the journey. You have to declare in Arabic that God is just the one God and that Muhammad is the true and mighty prophet. You have to then say your 5 daily prayers, not 3, not 4, but 5 daily prayers. They're short prayers. It's not too onerous, but you must do all 5 to undo the sins of the day. You've got to pay the 2.5% tax, the zakat, through the mosque, with 2.5% on all your earnings for the year. The fast of Ramadan. During the lunar month of Ramadan, you must go without food and drink during daylight hours as a sign of reverence to God. And then finally, you must make it to Mecca once in your life, the Hajj, the pilgrimage. And only then can you have a sense that your sins of the past will be forgiven. In some ways, this all makes sense. And I've met Muslims who have said, this is muscular religion. Christianity is weak and foolish. Because you don't own up to your sins. You don't make up for your sins. And my only response is, yeah, I found that I can't. I thank God that He forgives me. Not because of my atoning for my own wrongdoings, but because Christ atoned for my wrongdoings when He died on the cross. And that's where our narrative leaves us. It was now about the 6th hour, middle of the day. And darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour, for the sun stopped shining. Bizarre, right? But in about the year 55, the pagan Greek author Thales mentions an eclipse coinciding with the death of Jesus. And the curtain of the temple was torn in 2. Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." When He had said this, He breathed His last. In this moment, all my wrongdoing, all your wrongdoing was atoned for. Jesus bore into himself our guilt and shame. And I wonder if in that dark, dark moment, this criminal over here saw Jesus become more and more agitated, scream out, and then the darkness remain. I wonder if the criminal thought to himself in that moment, that was for me. That's for me. Hell for him, paradise for me. Condemnation for him, mercy for me. He forgave me because he knew he would die for me. Have you acknowledged Jesus' greatness on his own terms? Admitted your unworthiness before him and asked for the forgiveness for which he died? I have an embarrassing admission to make. When I was training to be a pastor at seminary, for about the first 2 years, I slept with an illegal, unregistered semi-automatic rifle underneath my bed with 200 rounds of ammunition. I'm not a shooter. This is not a commentary on any conversation that you might be having in this country. This rifle was a gift from a farmer out bush, Australia, out Gilgandra way. In Sydney, you might preach at someone's church and they'll give you a book voucher. Out in the bush, semi-automatic rifles seem to be the going trade. And this guy, Frank was his name, Frank came up and he was so touched by a sermon that I'd given in his church, he wanted to give me something that meant something to him, and he came and he gave me this semi-automatic rifle. I was so embarrassed, I went, thanks, and here's a bag of ammo, and I took it home. And when I got home, we used to live in the centre of Sydney, right in the centre, and my wife panicked. I walk in with a semi-automatic rifle and ammo, and she said, get rid of it right away, please. I don't want it in the house. I said, no, it'll be fine, darling, it'll be fine. She said, no, you've got to get rid of it. But then once you're in the centre of Sydney, how do you get rid of such a thing? You can't put it out with the recycling. You can't sneak out at night and bury it in the garden if a neighbour sees you. I didn't think a firearms offence would look good on my ministerial record, so I kept it under the bed for 2 years. My wife still begging me to get rid of this stupid thing. And then something very interesting happened. The federal government announced what they call the National Firearm Amnesty. According to the advertising, if you owned an illegal banned weapon that was unregistered, mine was both, you could just walk into your local police station, hand it over, no questions asked. It was the promise of the government. But I was suspicious. I thought this was a sneaky way of getting you on camera and then they'd track you, and I didn't think that'd look good as a trainee minister. So my wife said, please get it back. I said, I just don't think we can do it, darling. It's too risky. Month 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 went by. It was 6 months amnesty. In the 6th month, my wife basically begged me to get rid of this thing. So I did the manly thing and I got her to take it in for me. Man, it must have looked weird. This beautiful young mum with our little 2-year-old at the time in tow, with a semi-automatic rifle and a handbag full of ammunition. She handed it over, the policeman gave her a knowing smile, and she just walked straight back out. It turns out the amnesty was for real. They weren't lying. And I can confess this highly irregular moment in my career without the slightest fear of punishment, because I'm forgiven and forgotten. And that's what amnesty means, by the way. It comes from the Greek word amnesia, from which we get amnesia. It means forgetting. Forget the firearms issue. Think of this. God offers amnesty to anyone who comes to him. Acknowledges Christ's greatness, admits unworthiness, and asks for forgiveness. Amnesty, amnesia, forgetting all that we've done. But friends, you can't send your spouse on your behalf. You got to do it yourself. Will you acknowledge Christ's greatness, admit your unworthiness today, and ask for forgiveness? You know, there are two common mistakes people make when they're approaching Christianity. One, of course, is to not take any step until every question is answered. Do you know people like that? They're so nerdy. They so need every T crossed, every I dotted. They're not making any step in the right direction until everything is decided, determined, all doubts overcome. I have a mate like that, Graham. He's a statistician. Need I say more? And he's been around Christianity so long, but he doesn't make any step because he still has a few questions. He's had loads of questions answered, but he's still, he's just not willing to make any step until all of his answers, he gets all of his answers. And I was at coffee with him, and I said to him, mate, can you imagine doing what you're doing with a relationship? Wanting to know everything, wanting every question answered before you make any step in a relationship? And he said, oh yeah, I've done that once or twice. It's terrible. I said, well, it's the same with God. God is not a statistical formula. He is a person. And in personal relationships, if you've got a hunch, take a half step. See what happens. Then take another half step in the right direction. The other mistake, of course, is almost the opposite. It's not just not taking any step until every question's answered. It's taking every step except the final one. There are people who circle Christianity for a long time. They turn up at church, they turn up at Christian events. They just don't ever land. They just circle. I met someone in Bath, England, after I preached at an event. It was a kind of invite your friends event, and a Christian friend who'd invited this other woman along, and I got to speak to this woman afterwards, and it turned out she'd been going to these events for years. She'd had tons of her questions answered. She'd really made lots of strides, but when I said, so, are you a Christian yet? She said, oh, no, I haven't taken that step. I said, well, why not? She said, oh, I don't know. And I eventually said to her, look, you've been circling Christianity, it seems, for a long while. Have you got a good reason not to land? And she thought for a moment, and very honestly, she said, you know what? I've got practical reasons, none of them very good. And I can't say that she then became a Christian. For all I know, she's still circling, she's still attending Christian events, still making every step but the last one. So I want to ask you, wherever you are at in your journey, will you take the appropriate step? Maybe it's just a half step in the right direction. But for some, maybe it's that final step. You've got to land. It's time to acknowledge Christ's greatness, admit your unworthiness, and ask for forgiveness. So, Lord, will you please hear us, every one of us today. We acknowledge Christ is Lord. We acknowledge his greatness over me. And yet I also admit my profound unworthiness. I have not loved you with my whole heart, and I haven't loved neighbors as myself. But I dare to ask, because of Christ's death and resurrection, forgive me now. Forgive me now. Let me live in the reality of your amnesty. For I ask it in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Let's thank John again for being with us today. John, you're a gift to us. Thanks, huge, man. And I'm going to ask you to do something very, very difficult. I'm going to ask you to stand without checking out. here and at our campuses as well, can I ask you to stand right now? I just have a few seconds with you as I wrap this up today and try to just add a little something to what John has shared with us. If your way of viewing Christianity or your way of viewing life or your way of viewing religion is do more, try harder, do more, try harder, do more, try harder, I just plead with you to understand that Christ had a different thing in mind, that love cannot be earned, it can only be received, that forgiveness is not deserved, it's something that is received. I love what John said about, they're individuals, I won't take a single step until I got everything figured out. Can I just challenge you to start walking? Just start moving, get moving on the journey, see where it leads. And that last part was so powerful. I just know for some of you, it is just absolutely, man, it's time to land. And in one way or another, just to say, I am flawed, I am radically flawed, I am incapable of self-rescue, and this is why Jesus came and died for me, and I receive the forgiveness that he offers. Then allow Christ to direct your thoughts, your relationships, your mind, your future. I would just challenge you to land. And so may our gracious God be with us as we travel into our week. May he guide us in our relationships, in our joys, and in our struggles. At home, at work, and with friends. May we honor him as the God who loves and came for us. Amen. We'll see you next week.